The 20th century is one of the most fascinating centuries in human history, and that isn't just because it's the previous century, but rather due to certain revolutionary groundbreaking changes that happened at such a rapid pace that humanity had not seen before. The political order of empires collapsed and was replaced by nation-states. New technology allowed us to light up our rooms and doors, transforming our day-to-day lives. Our understanding of physics, time and space was transformed, and through that knowledge, we, as a species for the first time, gained the ability to completely destroy our civilization through the use of nuclear weapons. It is also the century that unsurprisingly lays down the foundation for the century we live in today, the 21st century. These are due to two main factors. One was the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism, ushering in the US-led world order and globalization. The other was the digital revolution that started during the 90s, which transformed our economy from being based upon industry, which it was beforehand, into information. In this video, I'm going to cover the people who I believe were the most groundbreaking of the previous century. Keep in mind that this is somewhat subjective, and you may come up with different conclusions than I have. And if you do, please let me know. I'm going to start off this list with a trio: Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Westinghouse. If you use electrical devices, and given the fact that you're on the internet, I'm pretty sure you do, you have these guys to thank, along with countless of other people who have been forgotten in the sands of time. Thomas Edison is oftentimes taught to school children as the man who invented the light bulb. And yes, while there's some element of truth to it, it's a gross oversimplification. However, he did play a significant role in the widespread use of electricity, including the use of light bulbs. Thomas Edison managed to combine his knowledge of science and engineering with his astute business acumen and work ethic to become one of the pivotal founders of General Electric, one of the most powerful megacorporations in the world. And though he managed to implement the widespread use of electric power generation, he isn't usually considered one of the top-tier scientific minds, and really more of a business figure. He was also a notorious patent troll. Many of his lawsuits led many Jewish businessmen to flee the New York tri-state area where Thomas Edison dominated to California and set up Hollywood, as Thomas Edison was pioneering in the film industry at the time. However, what Thomas Edison is also highly known for was his partnership and eventually breakup with the genius Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was an ethnic Serbian immigrant who migrated to the United States. And while he was known for being completely batshit crazy, he was an absolute genius, pioneering alternative current. Now, I'm not going to get into the complexities behind alternative current versus direct current in the scientific sense. You're more than welcome to watch videos that can do a far better job than I can. Nowhere am I going to spend that much time talking about to what extent it inspired AC/DC, the band. Regardless of this, there was some sort of competition between Thomas Edison, who had pioneered direct current, and Nikola Tesla, who would eventually team up with Westinghouse to spread alternative current, which by and large is considered to be more efficient. George Westinghouse is oftentimes overlooked when it comes to this sort of conflict, but he was actually one of the most pivotal figures in the spread of electricity. A brilliant inventor, innovating the railroad industry that dominated the 1800s. And in sharp contrast to many of the other major industrialists at the time, he was known for being a fairly moral and upstanding man, and a fair businessman. During the Chicago World Fair, guests were astounded to see an indoor building being lit up by bulbs rather than by candles. While this seems completely mundane to us today, this was absolutely groundbreaking for the time. And our day and night circadian rhythm was no longer dependent on the sun and moon. Next on the list is Teddy Roosevelt, or Theodore Roosevelt. The 20th century is oftentimes called the American century because it's the century in which the US has been indisputably the most powerful nation. Although it wasn't like this for the entirety of this century. In fact, at the beginning of the 20th century, the US was really only getting started. Teddy Roosevelt is considered to be the first modern president, a member of the Dutch aristocracy that had run New York City since the colonial days. He would rise up the ranks, in part due to his own background and in part due to his own intelligence and hard work, and fight successfully in the Spanish American War. This war proved to Europeans that the US was no pushover. He was also progressive when it came to the foundations of much of the social safety net that existed in the United States. When he became president, he implemented the Square Deal. He set up many of the bureaucracies you might be familiar with, such as the FDA, and he was an avowed conservationist, setting up Yellowstone National Park. Having seen much of the inequalities that had been ravaging the United States in the aftermath of industrialization, he set up much of the foundations of America's social safety net and welfare state. On the international level, he was also a mediator and diplomat, winning the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the war between the Russian Empire and Japan. This made the US seem like a world policeman, an idea that is quite controversial still to this day. Under his administration, the US went from being seen as a backwater into a great power, and would eventually go on to become the world's only superpower by the end of the century. Moving on to the other side of the Pacific, we get Sun Yat-sen, quite possibly the most important figure in modern Chinese history. Throughout the vast majority of Chinese history, the civilization was run by dynasties with intermittent warring states periods. This was under a concept called the Mandate of Heaven, in which a dynasty would rule under the good graces of some supernatural entities, and when they fell out of favor due to, say, a famine or a war or whatnot, eventually the Mandate of Heaven would look for another dynasty. However, this was about to change, as China had been heavily humiliated during the 1800s by Western and Japanese forces. Sun Yat-sen understood that the way to stop China from its continued humiliation and rise to become the great power it once was to embrace some of these modern ideals. He adopted Chinese nationalism over the monarchy of the Chinese dynasties. This would lead to the collapse of the Ming dynasty and the entire dynastic system in 1911. The nationalists would eventually take control, and eventually the communists would split off and the two would fight, but even as the two were arch enemies, both of them honored the memory of Sun Yat-sen. Next on the list is Mao, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, after Sun Yat-sen passed, Chiang Kai-shek would take control. However, he proved to be incredibly corrupt, not particularly apt at running the country, and rather ineffective when it came to fighting the Japanese. So, Mao and the communists held an alliance of convenience with the nationalists for a brief period of time to defeat the Japanese. And once the Japanese were defeated, he eventually teamed up with the Soviet Union to acquire enough aid to defeat the nationalists. The nationalists, by the way, were backed up by the United States. Eventually, the communists would win, and would set up the People's Republic of China after World War II in 1949. The nationalists would eventually flee to Taiwan, a conflict that still has not been resolved to this day. Mao sought to rapidly modernize China, which was at the time backward and agrarian. He invested a lot in industrialization. However, this great leap forward led to a colossal number of casualties, and his policies, such as the Glorious Revolution, destroyed much of China's incredibly rich heritage. Nonetheless, despite his flaws, and despite the fact that his party has shifted far away from his communist ideals today, he is still regarded as the father of the nation. Next on the list is Henry Ford, another titan of industry. While Henry Ford did not invent the car, that honor probably goes to Benz back in Germany, who founded Mercedes-Benz. But nonetheless, Henry Ford did master the art and sciences of industrialization. engaging in vertical integration by producing many car parts within his own company, believing that he should pay his workers enough money so they could afford one of his own products. This led to the mass production of the Model T and other cars in Detroit, Michigan. Eventually, Michigan, and Detroit specifically, would be known as the Arsenal of democracy, given that much of the industry used to produce car parts was used to produce ammunition during World War II. However, Henry Ford's reputation has also taken a bit of a dip, given the fact that he was incredibly anti-Semitic. Hitler admired Henry Ford, and during his final years, Henry Ford actually got a stroke when he found out about the true horrors of the Holocaust and how much of his writing inspired it. Woodrow Wilson is next on the list. He was the president during World War I. He's the only president to my knowledge to have a PhD, and he came from Princeton University. A high-profile intellectual, but a controversial president. His reluctant entry into World War I did tip the balance in favor of the Allies, and in the aftermath, Woodrow Wilson laid out the 14 points of the new international order and set up the League of Nations. This was kind of like a predecessor of the United Nations. While many of his goals were noble, the United States Congress wanted to be isolationist, and as a result, Congress didn't approve, and the US wasn't even a member of the very institution that Woodrow Wilson set up. On top of that, while Woodrow Wilson is credited for the emergence of international liberalism, he was also vehemently racist. He was not particularly a fan of decolonization movements, and he was very racist towards African Americans. Next on the list is Sigmund Freud, hailing from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was born into a Jewish family, and he pioneered psychology and psychoanalysis. Now, it's very important to note that a very large chunk of his theories have now been discredited, or at the very least aren't taken very seriously, like who really takes the Oedipus complex seriously. And dream analysis is not exactly very empirical. And I would probably think that it wouldn't be appropriate for a modern-day psychologist to prescribe cocaine to their patients like he did. But nonetheless, he put the study of psychology, the mind and the brain and cognition on the map. And in doing so, set the foundations for our understanding of the very concepts and the very entities we use to understand the world. Next on the list is Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, who overthrew the crumbling Russian Empire in the midst of World War I. The Russian Empire at this point had been utterly humiliated by Japan, a country that wasn't even white, which in the eyes of many Europeans was doubly as embarrassing. On top of that, Nicholas's policies were rather unpopular. The people he often has persecuted were religious and ethnic minorities, such as Jews, and there was a massive underclass of Russian people working on farms with very few compensation and standards of living. On top of that, the beliefs coming from Marx and Engels in Western Europe had started to spread. This inspired a lot of people, like Vladimir Lenin, to take up the mantle of communism. While Russia was busy fighting World War I, the communists would rise up and eventually overtake the Russian Empire, which had already been exhausted fighting the Germans and Austrians. The communists would overthrow the Tsar, killing him and his family, and fighting off various oppositional forces, creating the first socialist state. And while most of his policies have been, let's just keep it real, economic failures, he is still seen as the first major communist political leader. Eventually, he would be replaced by Stalin. Stalin was not exactly first on the list to replace Lenin, but nonetheless, he eventually did so by, killing everyone else who was opposed to him. He was probably the most evil man of the 20th century, and that is saying something. Killing around 20 million of his own people due to purges. However, he also transformed the agrarian nation into an industrial one, setting up factories and mass farms. Now, keep in mind that this led to a tremendous amount of starvation and pain for the Soviet people, but nonetheless, many Russians still see him as a hero of some sorts because he was also not only successful in modernizing the country, but also in fighting off the Germans during World War II, in which another 20 million died, but then again, Stalin was probably even better at killing his own people than the Germans were. In the aftermath of World War II, he really set up the foundations for the Cold War, overthrowing many Eastern European governments and installing communist dictators, which didn't work well with the Western powers he was once allied with. Speaking of nuclear weapons and the Cold War, we have to talk about Einstein, who completely revolutionized our understanding of physics that Newton set out during the 1600s. Newtonian physics is predictable. It's classical physics that is fairly easy to understand in our modern-day lives. However, Einstein proved that on the macro level, things were way more trippy and complex, that time and space were relative. This completely transformed our views of the natural world, and on top of that, his equation E = mc squared set the foundations for nuclear weapons. While Einstein was against the use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, his brilliance did lead indirectly into this vessel of mass destruction. And speaking of great destruction, the genius specifically behind this revolutionary weapon was Robert Oppenheimer. See, Einstein, who had fled Germany, eventually informed President Franklin Roosevelt, the president during World War II, that the Germans were planning on developing a massive megabomb capable of mass destruction. This led to the creation of the Manhattan Project between the US, Britain, and Canada to create a bomb before the Germans did. Oppenheimer was put in charge of this program, setting up research and testing in Los Alamos, New Mexico, in the United States. This would eventually produce the bomb before anyone else, and would give the Germans and Japanese second thoughts. Eventually, the use of the bomb led to the end of World War II. However, Oppenheimer spent much of the rest of his life in deep regret, knowing that his brilliance had been used to cause such destruction, and potentially the extinction of our species. Now, I've been talking a lot about World War II, but I actually haven't talked about a lot of the antagonists of World War II, so let's move on to that. We have to talk about Mussolini. Mussolini would be the founder of fascism, a far-right ideology that prioritized nationalism, militarism, conquest, and a cult of personality, revolving around a hyper-masculine strongman, encapsulated by bravado, aggression, and dominance. Mussolini, among others, founded fascism. However, keep in mind that he wasn't particularly too ideological. For example, he used to be a socialist, and he wasn't too fond of some of the anti-Semitic policies of his allies, given the fact that his mistress was Jewish. Nonetheless, he did jump on the fascist bandwagon, mostly for his own ego, and would eventually ally with Hitler. This was despite the fact that the Germans thought that the Southern Europeans were inferior to them. This made Mussolini fairly insecure about many of his ambitions. Nonetheless, he sought to recreate the Roman Empire. Alas, his Roman Empire managed to lose even in Ethiopia. And eventually, the Italians during World War II would prove to be quite pathetic, eventually being conquered, and he would be overthrown, hung upside down, and stabbed multiple times. And, of course, I have to mention the big H. Do I really need to say anything about Adolf Hitler? You already know tons of stuff about him. Just go watch any other video about him, because I don't want the YouTube algorithm to block my video. Moving on to Hirohito and Tojo. When we talk about the fascist leaders of World War II, we oftentimes overlook the Japanese ones. Throughout much of Japanese history, there was always a great deal of tension between the imperial court located in Kyoto and much of the military leadership located in Edo, now known as Tokyo, led first by the samurai and then by the actual formal modern military. However, during World War II, these forces eventually merged, led by these two figures, into one major institution capable of immense military victory and brutality across the Asia-Pacific region. Nonetheless, Japan, as we all know, failed. But Hirohito was spared from actually being prosecuted for his crimes and punished for his crimes. The Americans needed him as a post-war figure in Japan to rebuild the nation from a fascist empire into a liberal democracy, an opponent of communism. His legacy still remains extremely controversial to this day. And that brings us to FDR, quite possibly the most influential figure of the 20th century, and I would probably say the most influential political figure of the 20th century by a long shot. This guy is really under-talked about given the amount of influence he had. Like his distant cousin Teddy Roosevelt, he was a member of the Dutch aristocracy's descendants in New York City. However, his struggles with polio led him to sympathize with many of the poor and marginalized. He eventually became president during the Great Depression and instituted the New Deal, which would implement social democracy in the United States, creating vast mega projects and setting up Social Security. The legacy of the New Deal and its influence in ending the Great Depression is highly controversial to this day. What would definitely change his legacy forever would be the advent of World War II when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He was instrumental in leading the United States to defeat the Axis powers, and, with the help of the British and Soviet Union, would set up the foundation of the New World Order, not based upon empires, but rather based upon nation-states. He also set up the idea of the United Nations. In fact, much of that honor goes to his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who also deserves a spot on this list because she was the US's first ambassador to the UN and set up the UN Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, a charter that still exists to this day and is seen as the foundation of modern human rights concepts such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press, among many others. And of course, given that we're talking about the World War II roster, I have to mention Churchill, who I'm sure you've all heard of before. The British were the dominant power of the previous century, the 1800s. Winston Churchill himself was actually half American, and he came from a lavish background. He had served in the military. He served in World War I, specifically, and he had a mixed track record at the Battle of Gallipoli against the Ottomans, but nonetheless, he would eventually become a major figure in British politics, taking over from Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister at the beginning stages of World War II, leading Britain during the Battle of Britain, giving very legendary speeches about fighting the Germans on the beaches and in the streets, and eventually allied with the United States and the Soviet Union to defeat Hitler. In the aftermath of World War II, he coined the term Iron Curtain, the imaginary line drawn between liberal democracy and capitalism in Western Europe and the authoritarian communist Eastern Europe at the beginning of the Cold War. In more recent years, he's been fairly controversial due to his support for colonialism, and in particular his role in the Bengal famine. Another major European player was from France, the iconic leader Charles de Gaulle. See, France was also a major colonial power who was seeing its power disintegrate over the course of the 20th century. Charles de Gaulle was a conservative, but he also hated the far-right Nazis. He eventually fled to Britain when the Nazis took over Paris, but would triumphantly return when the Americans liberated it. Nonetheless, he had some issues with the Anglosphere world, with the US, the UK, Canada, etc., despite the fact that those countries liberated France from the Nazis. He wanted to keep France's culture and politics separate. He wanted to focus on making sure that France retained its image as a great power. Despite some of his hyper-nationalist leanings, however, he did engage in some forms of decolonization And on top of that, he did integrate policies and economies with that of other European nations, namely Germany, which would set the foundations for the modern EU. Speaking of forging nations with other Eastern European countries, I have to talk about Konrad Adenauer, which I'm mispronouncing. See, when the Nazis collapsed, Germany was left in a state of existential dread. How do we form a new nation? After all, the country was split in two, between the West Germany and East Germany. One was capitalist and democratic, the other one was authoritarian and communist. Konrad Adenauer was the Chancellor of West Germany. He was both anti-fascist and anti-communist, which made him useful to his allies. However, much of the policies of denazification ended up not working given how fascism was integrated into nearly every aspect of the economy, so he focused on a more pragmatic approach in recovering the economy. He set up the foundations of a stable democracy, in sharp contrast to the Weimar Republic, which was the previous democratic system in Germany, and integrated Germany's economy with that of France and other European nations. This ability to rely on American military assistance, as well as economic assistance from Europe, made Germany somewhat dependent on other European nations and thereby less belligerent. This, again, set up the foundations of the European Union. Let's move on to Asia, specifically the Indian subcontinent. Gandhi is another figure who needs no introduction. Gandhi was a lawyer who fought peacefully, if you could call it that, for Indian independence. Keep in mind that during World War II, India had suffered a lot by exporting grain and other food products throughout the British Empire, and many Indians died fighting the Japanese. Many of his contemporaries had a little bit more of a pragmatic approach than Gandhi himself. Gandhi wanted independence and a pluralistic society for people of all religions despite his Hindu background. However, his buddy Nehru was a little bit more pragmatic. He understood that there were deep divides between Muslim and Hindu populations in India. As a result, the British would split India and Pakistan. Nehru would become the first Prime Minister of India, as Gandhi was unfortunately assassinated by a Hindu nationalist. The partition between India and Pakistan led to mass disruptions and hundreds of thousands of people displaced and many killed. This was despite the fact that the actual independence movement led by Gandhi was largely peaceful. Nonetheless, Gandhi is still seen as a legendary figure in the Indian zeitgeist. Gandhi and Nehru together are considered to be the greatest figures of not only modern India, but also of decolonization and the humanity of the Third World. One guy who would be deeply inspired by Gandhi was Martin Luther King Jr., another person who I'm sure you've already heard of. His preaching and activism would eventually lead to the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the United States. He was heavily inspired by a combination of Gandhi, Jesus, Tolstoy, and others. Unfortunately, like Gandhi, he was also assassinated. Nonetheless, he is one of the most iconic figures of American history, and many consider him to be the greatest American that the country ever produced. David BenGurion is next on the list. Martin Luther King was quite fond of another project that had been brewing, and that was the Jewish state of Israel. This was led by David BenGurion, who was the first prime minister of the Zionist state. Now, Zionism was actually a concept that was coined by Theodore Herzl back in the 1800s. However, by the end of World War II and the aftermath of the full horrors of the Holocaust, many Jews were fleeing Europe and flocking to safety in what is now Israel. At the time, it was the British Mandate of Palestine. However, the British Empire was crumbling, and as a result of this, many of them wanted independence. This would eventually lead to Israel being approved by the UN. However, it would also lead to a series of Arab-Israeli wars, in which, for the most part, Israel won. Nonetheless, many of the tensions between the Israelis and Palestinians still exist to this day, which I'm not going to get into because it is quite possibly one of the most toxic forms of discourse I've ever seen. Putting Israel aside, another nation that pushes well above its weight is Singapore. Once a backwater port fishing village, it eventually became a part of the British Empire and a significant powerhouse during World War II, so significant that the Japanese eventually overtook it. However, when the Japanese were defeated, the British gave it independence. Lee Kuan Yew would eventually come out as the main leader and instituted a policy that mixed a social safety net with capitalist finance and trade. He incorporated Western liberal institutions with Eastern values of conservatism, harmony, and authoritarianism. He allowed people of various different religions and ethnicities to live in his city-state, despite the fact that he himself was agnostic. To this day, Singapore remains as one of the most influential countries in the world, a massive center of finance and culture. Speaking of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we get to Kennedy and Khrushchev, the two leaders of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, the closest humanity has ever gotten to going the way of the dodo. Khrushchev overtook Stalin and de-Stalinized the Soviet Union, turning it into a far less dystopian place than it was once before. Kennedy also inspired his nation, the United States, by speaking of a new frontier, and a world that was not quite as bent on imperialism and subjugation. While these two nations were head-to-head in a battle against the survival of humanity, these two men put their differences aside and eventually de-escalated the situation, and in many ways have become revered on both sides of the aisle for this. Aside from ending the Cuban Missile Crisis and getting assassinated, another thing Kennedy's really famous for is promising that the US would go to the moon, and that brings us to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the two first people to land on the moon, a completely different celestial body. Now, while they weren't the first humans to go to space, that honor would go to Yuri Gagarin, who was from the Soviet Union. They were the first ones to go on a different celestial body than Earth, and as a result of that, have cemented their place in human history. Their accomplishments have and will continue to inspire countless people who want to go to the moon or, in fact, just pursue a career in science and technology. Next on the list is King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. Now, this country had been somewhat of a backwater for a long period of time. The rise and fall of Islamic civilization had happened several centuries before. Nonetheless, the Saudi family would coalesce power around the settlement of Riyadh, and eventually spread, taking control of the two holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. On top of that, this land tended to have a lot of hydrocarbon resources. This put immense wealth and power in the hands of a Bedouin culture, a culture that, for the most part, had not been particularly advanced. Even during the ages of the Islamic Golden Age, much of what is now Saudi Arabia had been overlooked in favor of Baghdad or Damascus. Nonetheless, the Saudi royal family would rule political matters, consolidating power around the region, and would hire Islamists to rule the religious matters. This would create a sort of cultural synergy that would eventually make Saudi Arabia the de facto leader of the Muslim world, or more specifically the Sunni Muslim world, in sharp contrast to much of the Shia world, which was not particularly fond of Saudi Arabia. Nonetheless, this country would eventually ally with the United States to take care of hydrocarbon resources, and fight against communism. And while King Faisal was adamantly anti-Israel, he proved to be one of the most influential figures in the Middle East fighting against Soviet influence. Deng Xiaoping is next on the list. We have to get back to China. You really can't avoid China at the end of the day. I mentioned Mao before, but given his disastrous results, many people in China were looking for something different. Perhaps totally dogmatic communism just didn't work. And on top of that, China had seen itself becoming quite isolated, not only by capitalist Western powers, but also by the Soviet Union. Deng, however, was much more pragmatic than Mao. He really didn't care that much about communism. He really just cared about what worked. He's famous for saying it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it's good at catching mice. And as a result, he saw that while the authoritarian system of China had been quite effective at consolidating power, the communism was rather inefficient. He sought to implement capitalist market economies. And as a result of that, the Chinese Communist Party was no longer really communist. This led to a vast expansion of economic growth in China. It also led to a lot of corruption as well, but nonetheless, many Chinese people were pushed out of poverty into a middle-class lifestyle. He's also fairly controversial for his one-child policy, which has led to China's stagnation of demographics and a disproportionate number of men, and he stamped out the Tiananmen Square protests. While the transition out of communism in China was a gradual process, in the Soviet Union, later Russia, it was more immediate. Gorbachev, the last premier of the Soviet Union, implemented several reforms to improve communism. He was not an anti-communist necessarily, but someone who wanted to make it more adaptable, more efficient. And as a result, he implemented glasnost and perestroika, policies that allowed for more political and economic freedom. This again was created to make communism better, but what ended up happening was that openness allowed many people in Eastern Europe to see just how much better life was like in Western Europe. And as a result, many people in Eastern Europe revolted, and for the most part, the revolts were peaceful, with the exception of Romania. This led to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the communist alliance in Eastern Europe, and eventually the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Today, many Russians don't like Gorbachev, viewing him as someone who sympathized too much with the outside world, in particular the West. However, many people in Russia, as well as the West, view him as a great hero, ending an incredibly oppressive system of governance. The second biggest figure in the collapse of communism in Europe would go to Helmut Kohl. He was the Chancellor of West Germany around the same time communism was collapsing. He set up the foundations of the merger of Western and Eastern Germany after the Berlin Wall fell, resulting in economic, political, and technological powerhouse that still ranks as the fourth biggest economy to this day. Now, while there are still many issues between Western and Eastern Germany, the country is unified, and it has become the largest economy on the European continent, and the de facto leader of Europe. Now let's move on to technology. Tim Berners-Lee is next on the list. He's a British computer scientist who invented the World Wide Web, along with the HTML markup language. And if you look at your URL bar, you have him to thank. Unfortunately, he doesn't really receive that much credit. He's not really too much of a household name, even though he technically should be. See, throughout much of the 20th century, or more accurately, second half of the 20th century, the sort of proto-internet or intranet that was used among spies and scientists was more of an insular affair. It wasn't particularly user-friendly. However, with the Cold War over and economies opening up, This allowed for the digital revolution to take place. Something that was by and large developed by the US military can now be used for civilian purposes. However, at the time it wasn't particularly user-friendly. Tim Berners-Lee changed that. User interface became usable for ordinary people like you and me, and this would transform the world forever. Another major figure in the world of computer science would be Bill Gates, who founded Microsoft along with Paul Allen in New Mexico, and would eventually set up shop in Washington State. While Tim Berners-Lee made the internet accessible to ordinary people, Bill Gates and his team at Microsoft made the operating system of computers accessible to ordinary people throughout the use of Windows, as well as the implementation of a digital office work system, now known as Microsoft Office. I know that it's oftentimes easy to overlook Microsoft Office as being something rather boring and mundane, given the fact that most people in white-collar jobs will use it in their day-to-day lives. But you have to keep in mind that this completely transformed work environments. And then I'm going to get to the last figure on my list for the 20th century, Nelson Mandela. I have to mention an African figure, and nobody takes the cake more like him. Nelson Mandela is the most instrumental in ending the apartheid government, peacefully, mind you. See, South Africa was won by a white supremacist government that was brutally repressing its African majority. However, along with the help of him and Desmond Tutu, among others, the apartheid government would not end due to some violent retribution campaign of mass bloodshed as you saw in Zimbabwe, but rather end peacefully. And much of the abuses and racism under the apartheid regime would eventually be covered under the Truth and Reconciliation Project. Today, South Africa is still a major economic player on the African continent, the second or third largest economy on the continent, depending on what metric you use. And while Nelson Mandela's legacy is still cemented as one of the greatest of the 20th century, the modern-day nation-state of South Africa is still struggling from both the ghosts of apartheid and the ineptitude of the African National Congress, the party that Nelson Mandela was a part of. And there you have it. Those are the most influential figures of the 20th century. If you have some people that you thought I missed out, please let me know. I'd like to hear about it. Thanks for watching. Bye.